So welcome back to a short one this time, which is just to finish off what we talked about last time and extend it into a slightly broader topic. So the thing that we're going to finish off is, last time what we talked about was how, if you look at everything in trade and supply chains and e-commerce, from stuff coming out of the ground, mining, to supply chain management, supply chain ERP systems, things like this, that there's innovation soup to nuts all the way through the chain from things coming out of the ground to things being and we sort of stopped at the point where we're talking about supply chains and didn't really get into e-commerce, the distribution side. And so we're going to talk a bit about e-commerce more broadly, and then sort of move the discussion a bit more to what makes an internet company. Is it more to do with, let's say, the data, the analytics, or the distribution, the marketing, the acquiring customers? And that plays nicely into the sort of play off between, in unit economics, between customer acquisition costs and lifetime value. So to kick off with the e-commerce stuff, we've done a bunch of investments at Anthemis in this space recently. We've seen some capitulation, if you like, in terms of the innovation here, and people getting sort of worried about it in terms of the overvaluation of one click, then the failure of some of the faster growing one-click systems, that being a very noisy market. But at the same time, there's a feeling that something's up in e-commerce from really the entry, both of the financing and the long tail coalescing onto Shopify. They changed the marketplace and shifted all the innovation away from the short tail, i.e. Amazon, into the long tail, which is always, being a more fragmented market, is always a much more interesting area. So I wondered if you had any thoughts there before I sort of brain dump some of my things.
Yeah, I mean, hypothesis to throw out there that we're in the relatively early innings, not the very beginning, but relatively early innings of an unbundling and a rebundling, but in a different configuration of the, for a good shorthand, e-commerce stack, e-commerce in the sort of broadest sense of the term. And I think that's really interesting, because, and there's some analogies, and we always are cautious about copy pasting analogies, but we're also think it's useful leverage to use pattern recognition. There's some analogies with financial services in this sort of unbundling and rebundling, and I think a lot of the narrative, at least in fintech or financial services, has been directionally right, but kind of missed the point that the rebundling isn't like go back to the way it was. It wasn't this sort of sine curve of like we unbundled and we rebundled and unbundled and rebundled. It was rebundling it differently. So it's almost like having a Lego castle, and you take all the pieces apart and then you build like a spaceship instead of a castle, sort of thing. Yeah. I think that's happening in e-commerce, and the vectors that, as you know, that we try to look at when we're looking at potential investments or even just sort of understanding space. Okay, what does that rebundling look like? Even if it's not going to happen right away, like what are actually to drill that down to more like first principles is what are and actually that's what I think is exciting about the 21st century, the internet enabled world, is you can go down to first principles and look at, okay, what are the key value drivers in various different situations? And this is a bit of a thought experiment, so this is probably not strictly true for the pedants out there, but there is, you can optimize against that theoretically, and certainly projecting forward with as technology evolves and these different levels of infrastructure and orchestration layers are built, you can predict reasonably robustly that directionally you can optimize for those value drivers. Whereas if you go back into the 20th century or whatever, look at stacks, it was sort of like water. People didn't talk about it because it was sort of commonly known, either implicitly or explicitly, that this wasn't the optimal way to do something theoretically, but it was certainly the local optimum given the constraints of information costs, transaction costs, all sorts of different constraints, real and informational. And those are, well, interestingly, the informational ones are disappearing or asymptotically going to zero, whereas the real ones are probably now, as to our conversation last time, going away from this asymptotic movement to zero. And I don't know where they're going to settle, but it's not going to be zero. And so that framing is, I think, interesting to think about. Okay, what will the world look like tomorrow and the day after tomorrow in e-commerce? What are the key value drivers in terms of creating? And I think the people and the companies that pick a spot on that value chain or that value framework and are good at it will crush it. And there's going to be a lot of carnage around.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And I think there's a very specific area where as you say, the unbundling and the rebundling that creates a different bundling, different format is happening. And one through, as you know, my bugbear is the sort of misuse of the term headless, but it's being misused in a way that means something. So to unpack that, what I specifically mean is that the long tail, as we say, which was served by Shopify and not, let's say, Nike, who would have their own platform.
Talking about headless commerce, not headless investing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry. I should so headless e-commerce. Yeah. So headless e-commerce was driven by the fact that there was a sweet spot of the bigger vendors on Shopify became sufficiently big that Shopify, originally these things would be on WordPress, they would be using WooCommerce as a plugin, then they would move on to Shopify. They weren't yet big enough to use whatever the enterprise tools were, but the flexibility wasn't there in terms of the templating, in terms of the front end on Shopify. So they decoupled Shopify into a front end and a back end. Ironically, that was called headless e-commerce, created an opportunity for heads for the headless commerce, which are sometimes called headless products, even though they're by definition the opposite. And these products have also played into a very new phenomenon, where there is no shop, where once you have an API into the back end and you have a TikTok video, or you have...
It's like if somebody's watching us today and says, oh, I really fancy that blender behind you, David. I just click on it and it's shipped to me, or, an offer pops up and
exactly. And so what I love about this model is the ad is the shop, and that everything compresses bang into this really efficient stack where there's a very clear front end and back end. And it creates more authentic marketing, because it means the marketing is at the point of you're going back to things which are not, let's say, George Clooney, very wishy-washy. George Clooney is paid to drink Nespresso, and we know that he kind of probably doesn't drink Nespresso, but and we know that...
Actually, that's one product where he probably did, because everybody does.
Okay, we don't know. I mean, it's a...
yeah.
Whereas when we're buying from an enthusiast, on TikTok or an influencer, often this stuff is genuinely authentic. It's someone who really knows the product, is a real nerd about the product.
Can actually tell you the difference between the 17 different colors of espresso pods and...
Exactly. And they'll be there. And so I love this stuff. It has authenticity and it allows people then to fragment things. So I think it's permanent. And I think it means that even the physical retail store is becoming more like a marketing product. If you like, the shop window is the store. So yeah, the word store implies that you have to storing things. What's the point? Once everything's been fulfilled by a back end, the store is a showcase.
Yeah.
The store is the shop window. And at that point, you can have pop-up stores everywhere. You can have these transient places, and the experiential element, the marketing element, is everything. It just happens to be the most tangible marketing component.
And ironically, or maybe not ironically, but interestingly, in that sort of theoretical, because I think it's mostly theoretical, but tangible, like not theoretical, like fanciful, but theoretical, not yet implemented. There's a lot of complexity that's actually taken out of the system. It's actually a lot simpler in many cases. And you talk about like store inventory, like, look at, one of the catalysts, Target and Walmart, getting crushed because their inventories, they've mismanaged inventories. These are probably two of the smartest, most data-driven retailers in the world. And, it's an impossible problem to solve, especially when there's exogenous shocks and dislocations or what have you. I'm not saying that by getting rid of that, you get rid of those exogenous shocks and what have you, but potentially you distribute, like, again, this is the pendulum swinging. Target and Walmart succeeded because in a world where you couldn't distribute those risks properly, it was better to have someone centralized that was super expert at doing it. And it didn't mean they were immune to always getting it perfect or, never getting it wrong. But, the pendulum, I think, is going back the other way, where it doesn't mean there will never be shocks or problems, but where that, coming back to our conversation last time, from the factory floor to the consumer's front door, if you can actually make that connection,
exactly.
You reduce the entropy, like you reduce the risk. You don't eliminate it, but you reduce the risk, it's more distributed, right? So you don't have these single points of failure, right? That manufacturer, if they completely fuck up their production cycle, or their inventory cycle, they'll be screwed. But
no, I agree. So we know that those supply chains are going to become more flexible. Resilient was maybe the wrong word, as you rightly pointed out once. Therefore, they get broad because they compress. We know that things like buy now, pay later can pass the financing straight to the wholesaler. Why do they need a retailer? So everything is wholesale, and then the front end is the retail happens in the experiential layer, the ad, whether it's a billboard, whether it's a shop, whether it's a and those two things become highly compressed and highly efficient on one level. So they become flat and broad to have the flexibility. So there will be lots of places you can buy things. There will be flexibility, if you like, or resilience there. But the distance between something being fulfilled and something being bought compresses. And into these two layers. So.
Sort of like that. I was just thinking it's sort of like or an intermediate, like, again, Back to the Future, it's like an Argos type model or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, before I joined Anthemis, the product that I'd done in New York was I sort of created the first visual bookmarking site, which then Pinterest became obviously the platform that did that at scale.
Why? Okay, so I'm just looking at time. Why is Pinterest not succeed, as far as I can tell, not succeeded in really making that happen?
So this is where there's an opportunity. I think so. Pinterest got the craftsters and got the Pinterest works because the amount of dopamine, that's the microdosing of dopamine from creating.
Well, but like, the tip, I get why Pinterest works.
Again.
Why, like, everybody from all of their users to the random person in the street sort of gets that. Oh yeah, that should be it. To your point, the e-commerce play.
Because people choose pictures, not transactional pictures.
Yeah.
So Pinterest will never not be polluted by pretty pictures of stuff you can't buy. Because, for example, the nicest table will always be the prototype that some architect's done that you can't actually buy. Like when you try and look for prefab buildings on Pinterest, it's impossible.
But why? So, but even there, so that let's drill down in that example. That table, if there's like 50 people, given their scale, that doesn't seem like an incredibly crazy number. 30 people clicking on, I want to buy that. Why wouldn't you just spin up and build?
Because, as we know, manufacturing is exactly what happened with all these hardware startups. It doesn't scale. You have to have in advance got your factory set up and tooled up to do it. And like that's why Fitbit was such an outlier in terms of building hardware. They really, really got into the weeds of it. So this is where I think, by the way, there's an opportunity.
That's a high value item. And it's like, there has to be, okay, this is a trader. I mean, there has to be a price for that. Like, I get manufacturing doesn't scale. The price, people want to pay $100,000 for that table. God, you have to be able to make that table, 30 of them.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the 50 people that want that table are the 50 people that are in the market for an IKEA table. And then, so I think there is an opportunity there for a highly transactional system, which is to take the one-click model. The one-click model is, unlike buy now, pay later, you've captured the shopping cart. So you have highly structural data where, let's say you've clicked on, I want a t-shirt and it's red and it's medium.
Yeah.
That in your shop, a lot of people leave their shopping carts full of stuff that they want but aren't ready to buy. That's a standard use case for shopping carts, but it's not aspirational, because a lot of the non-aspirational stuff is on Amazon, for example. But once you go into the Shopify world, a lot of it is quite aspirational and in this sort of fragmented market. If you can take the one-click model and expose publicly your shopping cart of stuff you almost bought as a wish list, you've created a curated store, and you've created a Pinterest that's only of stuff you can buy. And so that's where I think there's an opportunity in terms of distribution, because all of the one-click companies are trying to get distribution by partnering with the vendors. But so partnering with vendors has virality.
Put aside the big box. What happens to the small curated? Let's say a good retailer, maybe a specialist retailer in sports equipment or jewelry or whatever. What happens to them in this world, do you think?
Well, they're the equivalent of the influencer doing video. Are they? Maybe their store has to become much more. They have to become much more engaged, probably, and much more digital. And maybe it's a series of videos of them showing the stuff, trying it out.
Does it make sense that they turn into essentially fulfillment centers, right?
Or influencers, either
influencers and fulfillment. And fulfillment, I don't mean that in a sort of derogatory, or like fulfillment in you bought this pair of hiking boots, or you want a pair of hiking boots, and that's where we can give you advice. That's the influencer side and all the rest of it. And then we can actually deliver them, make sure they fit right, send you on your way.
And for higher value stuff, exactly.
For higher value stuff, for $5 whatever.
The curated competitor to Rafa for cycling could have all of the really niche stuff, and eventually the fulfillment, the back end's there, but all the value add on top of the fulfillment, and all of the pitching and the trialing of the stuff, and the sort of the.
Because it would seem to me that if you could, because I know that one of the problems that they have is it's inventory. So how many do you order? How many of those hiking boots do you order, and what SKUs? What sizes or whatever. Yeah. And that's a horrendously hard problem to solve. And then the manufacturer of those hiking boots has the same problem as how many do I sell? How many do I make, and who do I sell them to? And inevitably, especially again for higher value, and I think the world is going to sort of higher value, more curated, more, then you've got in the whole world, there is largely sufficient number of size 42 Model X hiking boots, but they're all distributed wrong. So, for random reasons, one store, they had bad weather, the other store had amazing weather, and I know from that's a super hard problem to, the e-commerce or the finance guy in my head says, well, just, where you sent all the boots, right? If you're the Acme Corporation that makes hiking boot X, you sent 20 boots here, 40 boots there, whatever, just find them and reroute them.
Yeah. So TikTok will store inventory for you for a massive fee, but you can see, particularly as interest rates rise, the financing opportunity for this buffer, for basic, this piece of inefficiency, which is the storage, the stock, that becomes more and more expensive as interest rates rise and the cost of capital increases. So it becomes a big financing opportunity for people to very efficiently manage whatever that buffer needs to be.
Yeah.
And because it does need to be in one place, if you are someone selling stuff through TikTok, you have to ship the stuff to China on a pallet to sell to the Chinese now. And it has to be stored there, and there is a cost then to you of that delay. So I suspect that
there's so much opportunity in the space. And when I say opportunity, I mean, I don't mean falling off a log opportunity. This stuff is super hard, but it's very real, and it's just ginormous. I was just I'm sorry, I've taken too much paracetamol today, I think, but I was just sort of thinking as you were talking about, those kind of examples, like fulfillment by Amazon or Shopify, that's just scratching the surface, right? And actually, I think in some ways, there's going to be like a Cambrian explosion of those, not because Amazon and Shopify aren't doing a good job, but that like horses for courses, right? Depending on the value, depending on the scope, depending on the distribution networks for individual products.
We know it's all changed structurally, and we've seen, and headless has been this little tiny thing that has opened up a completely new model, where I say that's why e-commerce becomes fascinating, from mapping the world's seas to see how much cobalt we need coming from near geothermal vents instead of from the DRC for batteries, all the way from extreme stuff like that in terms of mining, right through to TikTok videos and people directly selling through an interactive video that used to be called an ad.
Yeah.
You buy, it's QVC.
Like the home shopping network times.
QVC, but with then the ultimate irony was that when you had a finite number of channels, the QVC was so expensive that you had this very sort of bland experience. And that ironically, as you open up the number of channels, you get this very rich potential experience in terms of
because they had to sell a billion of whatever they were selling, and so it had to be lowest common denominator. I know all that because I watched that. What was that movie with Jennifer Lawrence? Good movie, when she was selling her mops or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I remember the in-flight magazine that was ubiquitous in the US that had tons of stuff you could buy.
Oh, Sky Mall.
Sky Mall, yeah. I thought, oh, this is brilliant company.
I always thought
horrendous.
Sky Mall it was too close to Skynet, and people got nervous about it.
But it had no conversion, like nobody bought anything. Amazing. You had people with one thing to read, which was a shop on a plane where you can't get out, and yet it didn't convert because you couldn't buy within the ad.
Yeah.
So, that captive audience now potentially is kind of interesting. So
no, that's the key. You have to be able to buy within the ad. I mean, actually, okay, but maybe for a future one, maybe when we can wrap this into like buy now, pay never or whatever, but like if you could, because I was just thinking if you could buy, if this world that we're talking about existed, and I didn't change my behavior. So I'm quite, well, I don't know, maybe people have, most things I don't buy that I want because I don't have time and I can't be bothered, but I see lots of things. It's like, ooh, that's shiny. I would really like that. And oftentimes, more often than you might think, I even bookmark it, right? To say, oh, I'll come back, and I never do because I don't, but if I could like sort of buy it instantly, I'd have, maybe I'd be bankrupt. Maybe I'd have too much, and I'd have too much crap that I don't need for sure. So it'd be interesting, like if the downsides of this world we're talking about, which I think that's why I sort of cynically tied it into buy now, pay later too. There's not just upside too, right? There's like, ooh, that blender, it's shiny behind David. I want one of those. Click, I have it. And then all of a sudden you've got
the referral fees built into that. Or as we've seen with buy now, pay later, where we saw that the customer acquisition cost was passed on as a lending. The cost of the loan was taken by the vendor in exchange for the customer acquisition cost being reduced. So it's possible, all those things we just talked about with inventory financing, that those costs could be passed on as well if there was the right model.
Yeah, but then this is more of a social question than a business question. Is like, if all this works, which I think it's highly plausible that could and would and probably will one day, then there's a social problem. It's like back to all problems are the same. It's like credit card, like people buying too much stuff because it's too easy. Like if you take too much friction out of a process, what happens, right? And we don't talk about like the direction of travel has always been take friction out, right? We talked about this in terms of supply chains and to efficiency, and like we lost all resiliency. Here's another, like it's like the balloon. If we push on here, we'll take all this this friction out of the buy process and even the supply chains. Like this magical future world. Okay, where does that go? Well, it goes to people needing to, like, depends on how fast that happens, because if it happens over a generation, the generations adapt to it. If it happens really quickly, like people like me who are used to like a highly frictional world of buying things, all of a sudden get into trouble because there's no friction anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that friction, let's say we know that mispricing creates liquidity. If I sell you, as we said previously, a gold bar for $1, that's highly liquid transaction because you will buy a gold bar for $1.
Yeah.
And so the mispricing, if you like, there you could argue is noise in the system, i.e. friction in the information carried, like mispriced. So I think, I mean, that's a topic we can maybe close on today, but say that that's a topic we should explore later, which is throughout everything we look at Anthemis, we take a systems view, and the systems view by nature is a trade-off between things. It's not one extreme or the other. We know that there always is a balance in supply chains between efficiency and resilience, or there's always a balance between efficiency of flows and liquidity. So I think it's something we could talk endlessly about, but it's a common theme that in information, we know that the really big one is the internet is breaking society because it hasn't yet found that balance of how connected it is and how disconnected it is to become a small world network. We know provably that these things are better networks.
And then, and too often, the human nature isn't layered on, or worse, and very often worse, it's layered on in a very cynical way by someone looking to exploit it. But human nature being what it is, if you take friction away without context or without, I don't want to be patronizing, but part of the mortgage crisis that led to the global financial crisis was a lot of friction was taken away. Some of that was actually good friction, like securitization, or I'd say like good reduction of friction, good technology innovation, and then but it was just that it becomes feeds on itself, and human nature is what it is, and it became super easy to get a loan, and then race to the bottom, and boom, blow up.
No, absolutely. So I think that's a topic we can explore in another session. That was good. So we've closed up on e-commerce. Till next time.
Yeah, hopefully I'll be talking out of a bucket next time. Great. Thanks, David. Thanks everyone for listening.